The beautiful lie. Why you've never actually heard music. The room falls quiet. Three friends lean in, eyes closed, as the switch flips between two versions of the same song. One high RARs, one plain CD. They swear they hear the difference, until the scores come back near random. Confused laughs, awkward shrugs. Here's the weird part. You've never actually heard music. Not the way you think. Your ears catch fragments, your brain reconstructs a story. Digital audio takes advantage of that. Sampling, quantization, masking, all clever shortcuts. If people can't reliably tell formats apart, why do so many swear they can? Billions ride on that belief. Rewind. Let's start with the ear. Roadmap. What you'll learn and why it matters. Here's where we're heading. First, we're going inside your head, because your brain, not your headphones, is the real instrument. We'll look at how hearing is mostly prediction. Masking hides sounds in plain sight, critical bands cluster frequencies, and your cortex fills gaps you don't know exist. If perception is constructed, fidelity gets complicated fast. Then we'll turn air into numbers without the scary math. Nyquist-Shannon says 44.1 kilohertz sampling can capture the entire human hearing range with room to spare. We'll talk about why anti-aliasing filters need buffer zones and why higher sample rates help filter design, but don't magically reveal hidden detail. Next, depth. Bit depth sets how finely we measure loudness. Quantization creates tiny errors. Dither turns that distortion into gentle noise. 16 bits give about 96 dB of dynamic range, enough for quiet rooms and loud moments. We'll show why 24-bit rules in production, but often doesn't change playback. Then the high RARs fight. Specs like 2496 and 24192 promise more, but controlled blind tests often land at chance. Trained listeners sometimes do better on percussion and wide dynamics. We'll look at where benefits might sneak in and where they don't, plus the real bottlenecks, mastering decisions, rooms, headphones, codecs. From there, we'll separate format from mastering. Vinyl and streams often use different masters, loudness, compression, EQ. They shape what you feel more than bitrate does. We'll unpack analog warmth as pleasant coloration and how nostalgia and ritual guide preference. Finally, we'll get practical. What upgrades actually matter? Room treatment, speakers, headphones, placement, the right master. We'll give you a playbook, ABX tools, and micro experiments you can try tonight. By the end, the beautiful lie won't feel like a cheat. It'll feel like design, engineering shaped around the way humans hear. Your brain is the real instrument. Close your eyes for a second and think about a lyric you misheard as a kid. Someone told you the correct words, and suddenly you couldn't unhear them. That flip wasn't in your ears, it was in your cortex. Hearing is active. Your brain guesses what should be there, then updates those guesses on the fly. The sound you experience is the brain's best story about the pressure wiggles hitting your eardrum. Psychoacoustics studies how that story gets built. Start with masking. When a loud sound and a quiet one sit close together in frequency or time, the loud one makes the quiet one disappear. Not physically, perceptually. The inner ear analyzes sound into overlapping filters called critical bands. Within a band, strong energy raises the threshold for hearing weaker details. So that soft brush of a finger on a string hides under a bright cymbal hit, even though both are technically present. Masking isn't just spectral, it's temporal too. A loud event can mask sounds just before and after it, thanks to how the auditory system integrates energy over short windows. That's why a sharp snare crack can wipe out tiny details bracketing it. Perceptual coders like MP3 and AAC exploit this. If the ear wouldn't notice a component because it's masked, throw it away. The lesson isn't that compression ruins music, it's that your hearing system has blind spots, and smart engineering uses them. Critical bands also explain why EQ feels nonlinear to us. Add a dB at 1 kHz, and you might hear it more readily than a dB at 15 kHz, because our sensitivity peaks around the speech region, and because bandwidths stretch with frequency. Loudness itself is nonlinear. Equal? Loudness contours show that bass needs more energy to feel as loud as mids at low listening levels. So the same track can feel thin or full depending on volume, even if nothing else changes. Your perception isn't a meter, it's a moving target shaped by biology. Now layer prediction on top. The brain uses context and memory to fill gaps. In noisy rooms, you hear missing phonemes in speech based on expectation. Music isn't exempt. If the groove implies a kick, you might perceive a kick's presence more strongly than the raw waveform alone would suggest. This is why tiny dropouts can go unnoticed in a busy mix, and why you can follow a melody through a wall of sound. You're completing patterns. All of this creates trouble for simple gear claims. When someone swaps cables and everything opens up, what changed? Hardware or expectation? That doesn't mean differences never exist. It means our perception is easy to steer. The clean way to keep ourselves honest is blind testing. ABX testing is straightforward. You have two known references, A and B, and an unknown X that's either A or B. Your job is to identify X across multiple trials. If you can do it reliably, there's a real audible difference. If you can't, maybe the change is smaller than your beliefs suggest, or buried by other variables like room noise, headphone response, or mastering. Here's a micro story that plays out a lot. A group sits down to compare a high-res file with the same CD version. They go cited first. People nod and trade adjectives. Then someone normalizes levels, runs an ABX plugin, and routes both files through the same DAC. The hit rate sinks toward chance. It's not that the group is wrong to love what they thought they heard. It's that the brain is doing what it always does, mixing expectation, context, and sensory input into a confident perception. Confidence isn't the same as accuracy. Stakes time. If perception is constructed, what should fidelity even mean? We could chase measurements beyond human limits, or we could aim at perceptual transparency. No audible difference under normal conditions. That's the idea behind standards like 44.1 kHz, 16-bit, and behind design choices like Dither and filter shapes. Engineering for ears, not oscilloscopes, is a philosophical choice, and it's shaped how music is made, mastered, and sold. There's another twist. Attention. Ritual changes what we perceive. The act of lowering a needle, cleaning a record, and sitting still primes you to listen more deeply. Many analog sounds better. Moments are really, I listened better moments, amplified by euphonic distortions we happen to like. Conversely, streaming on earbuds while walking through traffic creates a ceiling on how much nuance you'll notice, no matter the sample rate. So before we argue formats, admit the first truth. Your brain is the instrument. It masks, it predicts, it fills, it misleads with conviction. That's not a flaw. It's a feature that makes music resilient. You can enjoy a song through a tinny phone speaker because your cortex does heroic work. And it's why cleverly designed digital systems can discard data you'd never miss. If the brain is guessing, the next question is practical. What exactly are we feeding it? How does vibrating air become numbers that can be stored, edited, streamed, and turned back into motion with vanishingly small audible loss? To understand why good enough in digital is often very good indeed, and when it isn't, we need to talk sampling the simple way. How often to measure, what to keep, and how to avoid fooling ourselves with the wrong details. Let's turn sound into numbers without losing the music. Turning air into numbers. Sampling without the scary math. Start with the air. A singer opens their mouth, the vocal folds buzz, and pressure ripples race through the room. A microphone's diaphragm wiggles with those ripples and turns motion into voltage. That voltage is still analog, continuous. To store it, we take snapshots. Not photographs in space, but measurements in time. How often? That's the heart of sampling. Here's the promise that changed music. If you sample at least twice as fast as the highest frequency you care about, you can reconstruct the original band-limited signal perfectly. That's the Nyquist-Shannon idea, minus the math headache. Human hearing tops out near 20 kilohertz for most listeners, so a rate just over 40 kilohertz covers it. Compact disc settled on 44.1 kilohertz to leave a little room to work with. But there's a catch. Real-world sounds try to shove energy above the limit. If you don't guard the door, those ultrasonics fold back into the audible band as bogus tones, aliasing. So we filter before sampling using an anti-aliasing filter that rolls off anything we can't safely capture. Think of it like a bouncer at a club, checking IDs. Under 22 kilohertz, you're in. Over, sorry. That pre-filtering is why we talk about band-limited signals. Now, real filters aren't brick walls. They need a transition zone to fade from pass to stop. That's where the extra 4.1 kilohertz above 40 kilohertz helps. It gives designers a buffer so the audible band stays flat and clean while the filter does its work just outside it. Higher sample rates like 96 kHz widen that buffer dramatically, letting engineers design gentler filters with fewer artifacts near the top of our hearing. That's a real benefit for implementation, but it doesn't magically reveal dog whistle harmonics you couldn't hear anyway. Big misconception time. Higher sample rates capture timing better. It sounds right until you look closer. Sampling at 44.1 kHz doesn't mean you can only place events on a 1/44th 100-second grid. After reconstruction, timing information exists between those samples because the signal is band-limited and the interpolation is continuous. The math guarantees you can recover the shape, including zero crossings and transients, within the audible band. So no, the snare's snap doesn't smear just because the snapshots are 22.7 microseconds apart. The limiting factor in practice is more often the microphone, the room, and the analog chain than the sample clock. That said, filters matter for how those snaps feel. Early digital systems sometimes use steep linear phase filters close to the audible band, which could introduce pre-ringing on test signals, little ripples before a transient. Engineers heard that as a kind of etch on certain percussive sounds. Modern approaches shifted to gentler or minimum phase filters, pushing any ringing to the afterside of the transient or moving it higher in frequency where it's less noticeable. Bump the sample rate, and you can push all of that further into irrelevance. The point isn't that 44.1 kHz is flawed, it's that filter design is a craft, and higher rates give more elbow room. Another myth: 96 kHz captures more frequencies, so it must sound better. It captures more measurable ultrasonic content, yes, but unless you're a bat, that extra spectrum isn't directly audible. Where it can matter is indirect. Nonlinear processors, some plugins, saturators, or even analog gear can mix ultrasonics back down into the audible range as intermodulation products. In production, oversampling or higher project rates help keep those ghosts out. On playback of a finished, well-mastered file, there shouldn't be rogue ultrasonics to begin with. Let's talk about transients, because that's where people feel differences. Our ears are sensitive to onset cues. The exact moment a stick hits a snare, the click on a bass string. Those cues don't require infinite bandwidth. They require faithful reproduction of the audible band and wise filter choices. A well-designed 44.1 system gets that right. A poorly designed 192 system can still get it wrong. Implementation trumps numbers. Micro story. A drummer swears their high-rate stems feel faster. The engineer prints two mixes from the same session. One at 96 kHz downsampled well to 44.1, one natively at 44.1 using a sharp old filter. Blind. The drummer prefers the downsampled version. What changed wasn't sample rate. It was filtering quality and headroom choices during mixing. The lesson: the path matters. Meanwhile, the analog front end does the heavy lifting. The mic, preamp, and converter's analog filter set up what the digital side can even see. Quiet circuits with stable clocks and well-behaved filters make more difference than chasing a huge rate your system can't handle cleanly. And once captured properly, turning those samples back into motion, the DAC step, uses a reconstruction filter to stitch the dots into a smooth wave. Same story. Give the filter space to breathe, avoid ringing in the audible band, and keep noise and distortion low. So sampling, done right, isn't a crude staircase. It's a careful tracing of what we can hear, with guardrails that keep fakes out. Higher rates offer engineering comfort and headroom in production. Standard rates aim at perceptual transparency in playback. If numbers alone don't guarantee sound, what does? Depth. How finely we measure loudness between those time points sets the floor for noise in the shape of quiet. That's bit depth, quantization, and the little trick that makes errors disappear into hiss instead of grit. Let's go there. Bit depth, quantization, and the magic of Dither. We've set how often we measure. Now we need to decide how finely we measure loudness. That's bit depth. Each sample isn't a perfect, infinite precision voltage. It has to land on one of a set of steps. With 16 bits, you get 65,536 possible levels. With 24 bits, about 16.7 million. More steps mean smaller gaps between them. Those gaps create quantization error. When the true signal sits between steps, the converter rounds it to the nearest one. That rounding is a kind of distortion. It isn't random. Left alone, it correlates with the music. On quiet material, it can turn into low-level grittiness, a faint, zipper-like texture riding the tails of notes. That's not the vibe anyone wants on a piano decay. Enter Dither, the gentlest magic trick in digital audio. You add a tiny amount of noise, yes, add, to the signal before quantizing. That push randomizes the rounding error so it no longer tracks the music. Instead of correlated distortion, you get uncorrelated noise, which our ears find far less objectionable. Properly chosen dither can make a 16-bit render behave audibly like a system with much finer resolution at the threshold of hearing. How small is the noise? With standard triangular dither on a 16-bit file, the noise floor lands around -93 to -96 dBFS, depending on shaping. In a real room, FASE and outside rumble sit higher than that. Even in quiet studios, ambient noise often dominates long before dither does. The trade is simple. A whisper of hiss replaces a hint of grit, and the music's microdynamics remain intact. Noise shaping takes the trick further. Our ears are less sensitive at very high frequencies, especially at modest listening levels. So you can tilt the dither's energy upward, reduce noise where we hear best, push more where we don't. Shape dither keeps mid-band decays cleaner without changing the underlying 16-bit limit. It doesn't create information, it hides the cost where we're least likely to notice it. Let's anchor the numbers. 16 bits by roughly 96 dB of theoretical dynamic range. 24 bits push that to about 144 dB. On paper, 24-bit looks wildly better. In practice, playback chains rarely get close to those extremes. Your listening room, even at night, lives around 30 to 40 dB SPL. Comfortable peaks hover around 80 to 85 dB SPL. A clean system already covers that span with headroom at 16-bit. The extra depth matters more when you're working on the music than when you're playing it back. Production is where 24-bit shines. Recording at 24-bit lets engineers leave generous headroom, no need to slam levels near full scale, and still bury the converter's noise far below the quietest, meaningful detail. Every EQ move, compressor pass, and reverb sum piles math on math. Wider word lengths and higher internal precision keep rounding noise from creeping in. Non-linear processes like saturation or limiting can spit out low-level byproducts. Extra depth keeps those artifacts from quantization splatter until the very end. Then, at delivery, you downshift deliberately. You render to 16-bit for distribution and apply dither once at the last step. Done right, that final file is perceptually transparent to the 24-bit mix it came from under normal listening conditions. Not kind of close, transparent. The audible signature of the work survives the drop in numeric resolution because the drop is managed. Microstory. A pianist records a solo piece in a quiet hall. The engineer prints two versions, one 16-bit with no dither, one 16-bit with shaped dither. In the control room, they loop the last 2 seconds of a long chord. On the undithered render, the decay hits a faint, rough shelf, like it steps down a staircase and stops. On the dithered render, it breathes out to black with a hair of hiss. Blind, the pianist picks the dithered one every time. The music feels like it ends, not that it falls off a cliff. There's a myth that more bits make things sound fuller at any volume. Bits don't change tonality or punch directly. They set the smallest step size, and by extension, the noise floor and low-level linearity. If a 24-bit playback file sounds better than the 16-bit version, check what else changed. Different master, different loudness, or a poor 16-bit conversion with missing dither. The format label often gets credit or blame for the process. Quantization error isn't always the villain. Sometimes engineers want the grit on purpose. Old samplers and early digital boxes had limited resolution, and their crunch became a texture people love. Those devices didn't dither. They spat correlated errors that read as bite and edge. Today's plugins emulate that by switching off dither, truncating, or modeling quantizer behavior. Proof that bad becomes good when it's chosen and framed. So where should you care about bit depth? Care deeply during capture and mixing. Use 24-bit, leave headroom, keep the chain quiet. Care at export. Always dither when reducing bit depth, and do it once, last, after any fades. For playback, don't panic about 16-bit when the master is solid and the room is louder than the noise floor. The art lives above the floor anyway. This is the pattern you'll see again and again. Digital audio admits its limits, then shapes those limits around human hearing. Quantization creates distortion. Dither turns it into almost nothing. We keep what matters and put the cost where you won't feel it. With depth handled, the next sales pitch shows up: higher resolution files. If the floor is already below your room, what's the upgrade really buying? Let's test the promise and the perception. High-res audio, what it promises versus what we perceive. Here's the sales pitch in one breath. Jump to 24-bit, raise the sample rate to 96 or 192 kilohertz, and you'll unlock detail you've been missing: air around cymbals, room tone blooming, piano hammers snapping into focus. Under the hood, the claim isn't totally empty. Higher rates push filter work far away from our hearing, and longer words drop the noise floor. On paper, it's comforting. More room, more precision, fewer edge cases that could bite. Start with sample rate. At 96 or 192 kilohertz, engineers get wide transition bands for their anti-alias and reconstruction filters. That breathing room means gentler slopes and less chance of ripple or phase weirdness near 20 kilohertz. It also eases plugin design for nonlinear processes, saturation, clipping, certain virtual analog models where ultrasonics can intermodulate and fold back as junk. In studios, that headroom is useful. For consumer playback, you're ideally listening to a final master that already cleaned this up. There shouldn't be rogue ultrasonics left to cause trouble. Now, bit depth. 24 bits theoretically give about 144 dB of dynamic range. That's far below the noise of most rooms and electronics, and near or below the threshold of human hearing across most of the spectrum. The practical win is in production. You can record conservatively, peaks at, say, minus 12 dBFS, without flirting with quantization errors, and every DSP step keeps rounding error down. By the time it hits your player, a well-dithered 16-bit file can be perceptually transparent to the 24-bit source in normal listening. If a 24-bit download sounds better, check whether you're actually hearing a different master. So can people hear high res? Controlled tests complicate the hype. In a widely cited year-long series, Meyer Moran 2007, listeners, from engineers to audiophiles, tried to tell high-res playback from the same signal passed through a CD quality bottleneck. Their overall score hovered near chance, essentially random guessing. That doesn't mean nobody ever hears differences. Some studies and anecdotes show trained listeners doing slightly better on material with wide dynamics, clean acoustic spaces, or sharp percussion, especially under quiet conditions and with revealing speakers. But the effect when present is subtle and it's not universal. Let's talk bottlenecks. The mastering decision tree can swamp format deltas. A modern pop master might be limited hard, clipped gently, EQ'd for impact on phones, and normalized for streaming loudness targets. Swap to a high-res version from a label that used a less crushed master. And of course, it feels nicer. People credit the container, but it was the mix and master. Vinyl pushes different decisions too. More headroom, different EQ to cope with groove constraints, so it can sound better even if the raw technical spec is lower. Playback chains matter more than most spec sheets admit. Room acoustics dominate with speakers. A null at 80 Hz from your couch placement erases bass detail that number 192 kHz file can rescue. Headphones vary wildly. Their frequency responses can differ by 5 to 10 dB in the treble. That dwarfs anything formats are fighting over. DACs and amps, once competently designed, converge. Low noise, flat response, distortion below audibility. Past that line, attention and preference take over. Streaming adds another twist, take over. Streaming adds another twist. Some services label streams high-res, but deliver them through paths that may resample, transcode, or apply volume leveling. Bluetooth is its own maze. Most codecs are lossy, and even many lossless over Bluetooth claims involve compression that isn't truly bit-perfect end-to-end. In a subway car at 70 dB ambient noise, the floor is miles above any theoretical gain. At home, wired or stable lossless wireless with decent headphones can finally make a fair fight. But then, mastering and room step back in as the big players. There are real but narrow cases where high RARs can help at the consumer end. Transient, rich acoustic recordings mastered gently, played loudly in a quiet room on a revealing system, can expose minor differences in filter design. Minimum phase filters at high rates may sidestep pre-ringing entirely within audibility, which some describe as cleaner cymbal leading edges. The improvement is subtle, and you can often approximate it by choosing a good DAC filter at standard rates. Still, some listeners swear they feel a touch more ease. Microstory. A jazz trio records live to 24-192. The release goes out in 3 forms: a carefully noise-shaped 16's 44.1, a 2496, and a 24-192. In a blind, level-match session on big monitors, the producer and drummer correctly picked the 2496 over the 16's 44.1, slightly above chance on busy ride patterns. But they can't separate 2496 from 24-192 reliably. Later, they repeat the test on headphones and the edge disappears. Takeaway: conditions matter and returns diminish fast. So what does high-RARs promise? Engineering, comfort, margin for error, and marketing clarity. What do we perceive? Often less than the brochure implies, especially when mastering, rooms, and transducers dominate. If you enjoy the peace of mind, or if your catalog happens to use better masters in high-res stores, great. Enjoy it. Just anchor expectations. Past a competent baseline, the biggest audible wins usually come from choices, not container size. Which raises the next question. If many differences we hear aren't about sample rate or bit depth, where do they come from? Decisions in mastering. That's where records get their punch, their space, and their feel, and where formats start to diverge for reasons that have nothing to do with ultrasonic content. The mastering variable. Why different releases sound different. While that high-RARs debate rages, something else is steering what you feel. Mastering. This is the stage where a finished mix gets its final EQ, compression, limiting, sequencing, and level. It's not clerical, it's sculpting the last 10% that becomes the first thing you notice. And here's the twist. The same recording can ship with different masters across formats and platforms. That's why a vinyl pressing can feel open while the stream feels punchy but flat, and why a high-res download sometimes wins simply because it used a gentler master. The loudness wars made this visible. In the 2000s, competitive levels kept drifting up. Brick wall limiters shaved peaks, average levels climbed, and microdynamics got squeezed. On radio or earbuds, that upfront energy could catch ears. On a big system, it often felt fatiguing. Choruses didn't lift because there was nowhere left to go. A quieter master with 3 to 6 dB, more crest factor breeze. Transients poke through, the groove moves. 2 files of the same song can measure the same frequency content yet feel radically different because the envelope changed. Vinyl forces different decisions. The format has physical constraints. Too much sub-bass or sibilant top can cause tracking issues. Extreme stereo in the low end is risky. Cutting engineers adapt. They may roll ultra-lows, tame sizzling hats, and leave more headroom to avoid distortion and inner groove stress. Those choices can shift emphasis toward the mids and let transients survive without being slammed. Listeners call it warmth or space, but much of it is the master's shape, not the medium's mystique. Case study time. A rock album drops on streaming with a loud radio-ready master. A few months later, an anniversary vinyl arrives from a different mastering house. Fans rave that the vinyl reveals parts I never heard. When someone needle drops the LP and level matches it to the stream, the spectral tilt looks modest, slightly less 10 to 15 kilohertz, a tuck around 100 hertz, but the dynamic range is 30 dB higher, and the snare transients are 1 to 2 dB less clipped. In blind comparisons, people prefer the needle drop. They're reacting to dynamics and EQ, not to groove dust. Mastering also targets contexts. A pop single meant for phones might get a low-end lift around 120 hertz to read on tiny drivers, plus a little presence bump so vocals stay up front in noisy spaces. A jazz record may keep wide dynamics in a natural bottom because it expects quiet rooms. Classical releases often preserve the full span, banking on listeners who won't be in traffic. These decisions matter more than whether the final container is 16-bit or 24-bit. Streaming platforms add another layer, loudness normalization. Services analyze tracks and turn loud ones down to a target. If your master was crushed to be the loudest on the block, the service just attenuates it, but the damage, lost punch, remains. Meanwhile, a more dynamic master might end up at the same perceived level, but feels livelier because its peaks and valleys survived. That's why Mastered for Streaming has become its own ask. Leave headroom, avoid hard clipping, and let the platform's playback do less correction. Micro story. Two friends argue about a beloved 90s album. One swears the original CD hits harder. The other says the new remaster sounds bigger. They don't realize they're hearing two different mastering philosophies. The remaster adds low-end weight and trims 3 kHz harshness, but uses heavier limiting. The original is leaner with sharper transients. When they level match and blind test, the gym listener picks the remaster. The living room listener picks the original. Same band, different target. So when someone says vinyl sounds better, the honest follow-up is, which master? Vinyl often gets a bespoke cut that flatters the format's limits and the listener's ritual. Louder playback, centered attention, fewer distractions. Streaming often gets a version aiming to survive cars, phones, and normalization. If you compare those two and prefer the vinyl, you're probably voting for mastering choices and listening posture. Practical takeaway. If you want better sound tonight, hunt for alternative masters before. Chasing containers. Look for releases tagged Dynamic, Original Mastering, Pre-Remaster, or Mastered for iTunes Apple Digital Masters, where engineers aim for clean peaks, not maximum RMS. Check if the vinyl cut credits a respected engineer, and whether a needle drop community confirms it mirrors a gentler digital master. Level match before judging. You may find the biggest upgrade is a different version of the same album. This is the through line. Formats influence decisions, decisions shape feel. When high-res wins, it's often because it shipped with the careful master. When CD loses, it's often because it got the loud one. Once you see that, the romance shifts from myths about ultrasonics to respect for the people making those last calls. Why wrong can feel right. Analog warmth explained. Everything we've said so far sets up a weird truth. Sometimes the technically wrong version feels right. That word, warmth, gets tossed around like a catch-all. Let's make it concrete. A lot of analog charm comes from small, repeatable errors that our ears happen to like. Harmonic distortion, gentle compression, EQ curves baked into the medium, and mechanical color from moving parts. None of these are neutral. They're seasoning. Start with harmonics. When you drive certain analog circuits, tape, tubes, transformers, they generate extra tones that sit at multiples of the original frequency. Even order harmonics, especially second, line up musically. They're an octave above the note. That reinforcement thickens mid-range and adds body without sounding jagged. Odd order harmonics can get edgy when pushed, but at small amounts they add bite. Engineers use this on purpose. A vocal through a transformer-based preamp can feel more present at the same measured level, because those added harmonics shape how we perceive loudness and texture. Tape saturation is a slow motion compressor. As you push level toward tape's limit, the medium can't track peaks linearly, it rounds them. That rounding softens transients and raises average energy, which we read as fullness. Noise and hiss ride underneath, but they're steady and unthreatening. Hit the tape harder and you get more harmonic spread. Back off and it stays clean. That musically linked squish can make drums feel glued and bass sit in a pocket, even if a meter says you lost microdynamics. Vinyl adds its own fingerprints. The RIAA equalization curve attenuates bass and boosts treble during cutting, then does the reverse on playback to reduce groove noise and fit more time on a side. That round trip isn't a perfect mirror. Cartridge and phono stage responses tilt slightly, often leading to a gentle mid-emphasis and a soft top end. Then there's the geometry. As the stylist traces inner grooves, high-frequency tracking gets harder, which can soften sizzle and bring focus toward the mid-band. People hear that tilt as warmth because our ears anchor on clear mids and forgiving highs. Mechanical color stacks on top. The compliance of the cartridge suspension, the resonance of the tone arm, the platter's rumble, the mat's damping. Each one nudges the response a dB here, a phase shift there. A well-set turntable damps the ugliest resonances and leaves a subtle euphonic contour. You could call it inaccuracy. Your brain might call it character. The ritual matters too. Cleaning a record, lowering the arm, hearing the lead-in groove. Those steps slow you down and point your attention inward. You listen more, so you hear more. The format didn't change the music, you did. Now transformers. These coils of wire aren't just plumbing for voltage. They saturate gracefully, round transients, and restrict subsonic junk. That means a kick drum can get a touch of heft without flab, and vocal sibilance tames a hair without losing intelligibility. Mix enough small niceties and the whole picture feels richer. Digital can emulate this. Great plugins model transfer curves well, but part of analog's draw is that the nonlinearity is continuous and signal-dependent in ways our shortcuts only approximate. There's also the noise question. Tape hiss, surface noise, and hum would seem like negatives. But a low, steady noise floor can act as a perceptual dither for the analog chain. It masks the discontinuities of very quiet passages and gives your ear a reference bed. That's not an argument for noisy systems. It's an acknowledgement that a little constant broadband noise is less distracting than a sparse sprinkle of sharper artifacts. Digital's hiss, when present, is often shaped out of the mid-band. Analog's hiss lives there softly and can make silence feel like a room rather than a void. Here's where nostalgia sneaks in, but not as a punchline. If you grew up with certain records, your reference for real includes their limitations. The inner groove softening on your favorite side B ballad, the low-end roll-off on a bass-heavy cut that had to fit a long side, the gentle off-center wobble that added chorus to a pad. Your brain tagged those quirks as part of the songs. Later, a digital reissue that removes them can feel colder, not because it's worse, but because it's missing familiar cues. We don't hear with blank slates, we hear with histories. Microstory. A singer brings a mix printed pristine at 96 kilohertz. It's clear, maybe too clear. The engineer runs the vocal through a tube compressor, kissing the meter by a dB, then through a transformer DI. On paper, they've added distortion and phase shift. In the room, the vocal steps forward, consonants soften, sibilant smooths, and the band feels like it wraps around the voice. The singer says, "That's the record." The warmth wasn't more information. It was a better story for the same information. None of this means analog always wins. Push it too hard and you get mud, splatter, or loss of real dynamics. Vinyl can't carry subsonic stereo without trouble, and inner groove cutting strains hi-hats. Tape worn thin loses top end. Analog is an aesthetic, not a miracle. Digital can be sterile if you chase flat graphs without considering feel, but it can also carry the emotional punch with less baggage when engineers shape it thoughtfully. So why does wrong feel right? Because the errors are compatible with how we hear. Even order harmonics echo musical intervals. Soft clipping respects envelopes. Gentle tilts favor speech-centered sensitivity. Mechanical rituals prime attention. It's less about accuracy and more about synergy with perception. That's the beautiful lie from a different angle. Not fooling you, but flattering you. And as convenience reshaped how we listen, those flattering cues became a way to bring intention back into the experience. The convenience revolution and the cost we don't notice. 3 clicks. That's all it takes to jump from a 1972 soul ballad to a Berlin techno set to a debut bedroom pop track uploaded last night. That jump used to take a paycheck, a drive across town, and a Saturday afternoon. The convenience looks harmless, liberating even, but it changed how we listen, what gets made, and who gets paid. Roll back a couple decades. If you wanted a song, you owned a thing. Vinyl, cassette, CD, your shelf was finite. Choices meant commitment. You sat, flipped aside, read liner notes, let track 2 bleed into track 3 because moving the needle felt rude. The friction created focus. Today, the barrier is gone. MP3 cracked open the door in the late 1990s. The iPod blew it off the hinges in 2001, and streaming in the 2010s turned music into running water. It's everywhere, anytime, and the meter barely moves. Perceptual coding made that flood possible. MP3 and AAC borrow from masking. If a loud signal hides a quiet neighbor, toss the neighbor and save bits. To your ear, in typical conditions, the loss is masked anyway. That was the trade. Throw away what you're unlikely to miss to fit 1,000 songs in your pocket and 1,000,000 in the cloud. Later, bandwidth improved and lossless arrived, but the listening habits set by the early days stuck. Here's the side effect we didn't budget for. Abundance erodes attention. With infinite choice, our patience shrank. Data from services shows a lot of skips in the first 10 to 20 seconds. Hooks moved earlier. Intros shortened. The middle 8 became a luxury. Albums gave way to singles and playlists. Artists optimized for the scroll, not the side A arc. That's not moral panic, it's design pressure. The format nudges the art. The economics shifted too. A sale used to be a chunk of income at once. A stream pays fractions of a cent, pooled and split by opaque formulas. To make rent, many artists chase volume. More releases, collabs to ride algorithmic waves, relentless touring. Niche scenes bloom because distribution got cheap, but the median creator lives on thinner margins. When the pandemic knocked out shows, the fragility showed. Convenience didn't just change listening, it rewired livelihoods. There's a cost in the room as well. We carry music into every noisy space. Cars, gyms, trains. Ambient noise floors sit high. Earbuds aren't equalizers of nuance. In that context, a well-mastered 16-bit file and a pristine 24-192-1 collapse toward the same experience. You're hearing the road, the HVAC, the bus brakes. It's not an argument against quality. It's a reminder that context trumps container most days. The stream is good enough because the scene isn't quiet enough. Lossless streaming tries to square the circle. All the songs, all the time, with minimal codec artifacts. It helps at home, on decent gear with attention. But the bigger win came from curation. Playlists became the new radio, with gatekeepers swapped for algorithms. Discovery got easier, but it also got flatter. Songs become tiles in a vibe board. Great for mood, risky for craft that relies on sequence and surprise. And yet, while convenience conquered, a counter-ritual returned. Vinyl sales climbed year after year. Not because of spec sheets, but because a physical artifact creates a frame for attention. People stream to explore and buy records to care. The hybrid habit makes sense. An endless buffet for weekdays, a set table for Sunday night. One doesn't cancel the other, each serves a different listening mode. Micro story. A teenager finds a playlist, falls for a track, plays it on loop through a phone speaker. Months later, they visit a record shop with a friend. They buy the album, first physical music they've ever owned. That night, they drop the needle, sit still, and reach the same song. It lands harder. Nothing mystical happened. The format slowed them down long enough to feel the arrangement breathe. So what's the real cost we don't notice? Not just a smidge of theoretical fidelity. It's the slow drift from deep listening to background habit, from album arcs to atomized tracks, from sustainable artist income to scale or starve economics. The engineering behind streaming is brilliant. The compromise is honest. But if you want joy, you can't outsource intention to an algorithm. Make 2 modes, everyday streams without guilt, and set-piece sessions where you choose the room, the gear, and the master. Convenience gave us access. Ritual gives us meaning. The trick is remembering to switch gears. The signal chain. Weakest link rules. Here's the blunt rule that saves money and maximizes joy. The weakest link decides what you hear. Not the fanciest spec in the chain, not the priciest box. The worst performer in your path. And for most people, the worst performer isn't the file format. It's the room, the speakers or headphones, and how they're set up. Start with rooms. Put great speakers in a bad room, and you've built a sports car with square wheels. Sound bounces off walls, collides with itself, and builds peaks and dips that can swing 10 decibels or more. A single deep bass null at your couch can make kick drums vanish no matter how high-res the track is. Move your listening position a foot and the bass returns. That's not detail, that's physics. Basic fixes pay off fast. Pull speakers away from walls, form an even triangle with your head, and get the tweeters at ear height. Small moves, 6 inches forward, a few degrees of toe in, can clean imaging and stabilize bass more than any format switch. Add a few absorbers or even thick curtains at first, reflection points, and the stereo image snaps into focus. A rug between you and the speakers softens floor bounce. Bass traps in corners tame boomy modes. None of this is glamorous, but it's the cheapest way to unlock new speakers from the ones you already own. Headphones dodge rooms, but they're their own Wild West. 2 popular models can differ by several decibels through the mids and treble. That's night and day EQ baked into the hardware. The good news, you can choose well-tuned headphones and, if you like, apply correction. That single decision dwarfs the audible delta between 44.1 kHz and 192 kHz files. With IEMs, seal matters even more. A tiny leak kills bass and shifts the whole tonality. Before buying a new DAC, try different tips and check fit. You might upgrade your entire library in 30 seconds. Speaking of DACs and amps, competence is the bar. A modern, well-designed DAC measures flat, with low distortion and noise far below audibility. Past that, claims get fuzzy. If a DAC changes tonality, something's off, or it's adding color on purpose. Amps matter when they can't deliver clean power into your load, especially with hungry planar headphones or tricky speaker impedance curves. But once an amp has enough headroom and keeps distortion low, chasing blacker blacks becomes a wallet exercise. Cables? Keep them sane and solid. Balanced lines for long runs help reject noise, decent gauge for speakers avoids voltage drop, and reliable connectors save headaches. Beyond that, expensive metallurgy won't fix a flutter echo or a misaligned tweeter. If swapping a cable seems to change the sound dramatically, level match and blind test. Sighted listening is persuasive. Measurement beats marketing. A simple SPL meter app helps level match comparisons within half a decibel. A must, because louder nearly always feels better. Free room analysis tools with a cheap calibrated mic show where your bass misbehaves. That data guides placement and treatment. With headphones, look for published frequency response and distortion plots. They predict more of your experience than most adjectives. Let's make it actionable. If you have a speaker setup, spend your next budget on placement and the room. Mark a triangle, find first reflections, treat corners, then verify with measurements. Consider a subwoofer not for more bass, but for smoother bass. 2 subs placed well can reduce peaks and nulls dramatically. If you're headphone-centric, pick a model with the tuning you like, ensure a proper seal, and consider gentle EQ to taste. Then make sure your source can drive it cleanly. Check sensitivity and impedance, not brand mythology. Now protect yourself from your own biases. Do home ABX tests. Software like Foobar 200 with the ABX plugin or dedicated apps lets you compare 2 files without knowing which is which. Keep levels matched within 0.1 dB. When comparing gear, try a friend as a switch operator. If you can't identify differences over multiple trials, you've learned something valuable. The bottleneck is elsewhere. Great, go chase the bottleneck. Micro story. A listener swears a high-end DAC opened the stage on their favorite orchestral record. They invite a friend, level match within 1/10 of a dB, and blind the switch. The score drifts toward chance. Then they hang 2 thick blankets at first reflections and nudge the speakers 8 inches. The soundstage widens, the center locks, and the cellos stop smearing. They ABX the DACs again and still can't tell. The upgrade wasn't silicon, it was air. Here's the payoff. Get the transducers and the room right, and almost everything else falls into place. Formats become transparent, dithering does its quiet work, and you stop chasing ghosts in the last decimal place. With the listening chain stable, you'll hear real differences, masters, mixes, mic choices, and appreciate them more. Which is exactly where we're headed next, back. To capture and craft, where higher rates and deeper words earn their keep before the music ever leaves the studio. Inside the studio, why 24-bit 96 kHz shines in production. Back in the control room, everything we've said about formats flips from what you hear to how we work. Production isn't playback. Here, 24-bit and 96 kHz aren't bragging rights. They're elbow room. Engineers chase headroom, clean math, and predictable behavior when stacks of processing pile up. The goal is simple. Preserve choices until the last minute, then commit without adding crud. Start with headroom. At 24-bit, the noise floor sits so far down that you can record with peaks at -12 or -18 dBFS and still bury converter noise under the room's own hush. That frees musicians from dancing on red LEDs. A singer can lean into a chorus without clipping, a drummer can hit a little harder, and the take stays intact. You're not paid to micromanage meters, you're paid to get performances. Extra bits buy calm. Now picture the mix bus as a long conveyor belt. Every plugin nudges the signal. EQ curves, compressors, saturators, reverbs, delays. Each step does math. In finite precision, rounding happens. at 24-bit on disk with 32 or 64-bit float inside the DAW, those roundings live way below audibility, even after dozens of moves. Sum 100 tracks, automate rides, print stems, and you still have margin. If you start at 16-bit and handle it carelessly, low-level grit sneaks up. That's why more bits in production isn't about playback drama. It's about keeping mistakes too small to matter. Nonlinear processing is where high sample rates earn their keep. Saturators, distorters, modeled analog circuits, they generate harmonics above the source. At 44.1 kilohertz, some of those land above Nyquist and can fold back as intermodulation garbage. You can oversample the plugin or run the session at 88.2 or 96 kilohertz, so the junk lives safely out of band and gets filtered away. The audible result isn't more ultra-highs. It's fewer unintended sidebands muddying cymbals, piano attacks, and vocal edges. Plugins behave better at high rates, even when they aren't explicitly nonlinear. Certain dynamics detectors and envelope followers track transients more faithfully when fed more time slices. Filters can be designed with gentler shapes relative to the audible top without flirting with pre-ringing artifacts. None of this guarantees a better mix, but it removes landmines. You focus on tone and balance, not on avoiding edge cases. Micro story. A guitarist loves the crunch from a favorite amp sim, but hears a faint sandiness on palm mutes at 44.1. They switch the session to 96 kilohertz or enable 4-Bex oversampling in the plugin. The sand vanishes, the chugs tighten. They bounce the part back down to 44.1 for the project and keep mixing. The improvement happened in the processing stage, not because the listener needs bat's ears. Editing is another quiet beneficiary. When you cut breaths, nudge drum hits, or crossfade comp vocals, you're splicing at exact time points. At higher rates, fades cover more samples across the same real-time duration. That makes ultra-short edits less likely to click and crossfade smoother at microscopic scales. It's not that you hear 96 kilohertz fades, you just stop hearing your edits. Noise shaping and dither reappear at the finish line. You may deliver a 24-bit master to a label or streaming aggregator. But if a service needs 16-bit for a legacy path, you want control of that last reduction. You render at high internal precision, add shape dither once, and hand over a file that unwraps cleanly across platforms. The listener doesn't hear the dither. They hear the absence of truncation nasties. Headroom isn't only numeric, it's psychological. With 24-bit gain staging becomes forgiving. You can set conservative levels into compressors and EQs, avoid driving interstage clip points, and still print robust files. That reduces decision fatigue. When you're not constantly undoing accidental saturation, you make intentional saturation sound better. Musicians feel it too. A comfortable headphone mix at sane levels reduces vocal strain and keeps cymbals from bleeding into every mic. What about 192 kilohertz? In practice, 96 kilohertz hits a sweet spot for most projects. CPU stays manageable, plugins have space to breathe, and session sizes don't explode. Some sound design or classical sessions go higher for specific reasons: extreme pitch, shifting, exotic processing, but most pop, rock, and film work finds diminishing returns past 96. The proof is in the bounce. A 96 kilohertz workflow often yields 44.1 or 48 kilohertz finals that feel cleaner because the processing lived in a safer sandbox. Capture chains matter just as much. Good microphones, clean preamps, quiet rooms, these set the ceiling on what bits and rates can preserve. A 2496 file of a noisy air conditioner is still a noisy air conditioner. Conversely, a beautifully mic'd piano in a treated hall at 2448 can outshine a sloppy 24192 take in a boxy room. Rate and depth protect quality, they don't create it. Parallel paths pull this together. You might track drums at 2496, build a parallel crunch bus with a saturator oversampled, blend it under the clean kit, and feed a mix bus with gentle analog model compression. Throughout, your meters sit comfortably below zero, your noise floor stays inert, and your edits are invisible. At the end, you print two versions, a 24-bit master and a dithered 16-bit. On a good system, level matched, they're indistinguishable. That's success. The work you did upstream survived the trip downhill. So yes, 24-bit/96 kilohertz shines in production because it's practical insurance. It lets you work boldly without painting yourself into a corner, keeps DSP honest, and turns limits into afterthoughts. Then, When the music leaves the studio for living rooms, cars, and earbuds, you can trust that a well-made 16-bit file will carry the feeling intact. Next up, we'll tackle timing and transients, the place where myth and math often talk past each other. Timing, transients, and the myth of microdetail. We've talked rate and depth. Now we hit the part that keeps audiophiles up at night. Timing. The fear goes like this. If samples are 23 microseconds apart, at 44.1 kilohertz, how can we hear micro-timing and transients that feel sharper than that grid? Here's the twist. The grid isn't the music. With band-limited signals, reconstruction between samples is continuous, so the ear gets a smooth waveform with timing cues intact inside the audible band. Your auditory system is a timing beast. For localization, it detects interaural time differences on the order of tens of microseconds. That sounds incompatible with 44.1 until you remember. Those cues aren't single clicks. They're phase relationships across many cycles of mid and high frequency content. After proper reconstruction, those phase relationships survive. The ear cross correlates patterns over short windows and extracts delays smaller than any single sample step. Transients live in envelopes, not in infinite bandwidth. A snare crack feels instantaneous, but most of its energy sits below 10 to 12 kilohertz. Capture and reproduce that band cleanly, and the onset reads as sharp. If a system smears, it's often from filters, resonances, or room reflections, not from the sample clock. Early steep linear phase filters near 20 kilohertz could add pre-ring on test impulses, and people heard that as glassiness on certain cymbals. Modern minimum phase or hybrid filters push artifacts after the transient or above audibility, solving most of the digital pre-echo scare without changing the base rate. Another worry is microdetail, the idea that only high sample rates reveal the tiny inner texture of a bow or a breath. In production, higher rates help plugins behave, which can preserve texture. On playback, if the final master is clean, microdetail mainly lives in low noise, stable imaging, and good transducers in room. The difference you feel when a mix opens up often tracks a quieter floor and better channel matching, not hidden ultrasonic shimmer. Jitter gets invoked here too, timing errors in the digital clock. Excessive jitter can blur imaging and soften edges, but in competent modern DACs, jitter is typically far below audibility, and its spectra are pushed where it matters least. If a DAC seems to tighten transients, check level matching and filter choice. Many devices let you select slow, fast, or minimum phase reconstruction, and those curves change the feel of attacks more than clock numbers on a spec sheet. Interaural level differences matter alongside time. At higher frequencies, your brain leans on small level shifts between ears. That means stereo integrity, matched channels, symmetric placement, controlled first reflections, does more for timing clarity than changing file format. A room with strong early reflections creates comb filtering that muddles onsets. Tame those reflections, and the leading edge of a piano note snaps into focus at any sane rate. Pre-ringing fear deserves a concrete moment. Yes, an ideal linear phase brick wall can produce symmetrical ringing around a sharp edge. But music isn't a string of impulses, and the energy near 20 kilohertz is usually modest. Minimum phase filters eliminate pre-ring at the cost of post-ring, which our ears tolerate better. Move the filter knee higher with a 96 kilohertz system, and the residual ripples lie further out of harm's way. The audible takeaway is subtle and track-dependent. It's a matter of taste more than a blanket upgrade. Microstory. A percussionist claims a 192 kilohertz release reveals stick-on skin in a way CD never did. The engineer loads the same master into a DAC with switchable filters at 44.1. Fast linear, slow minimum, apodizing, level matches, and blinds the choices. The player repeatedly picks the slow minimum phase filter at 44.1 over the fast one and can't separate 96 from 192. What changed wasn't bandwidth, it was the timbre judgment domain personality. Then there's the ear's own temporal window. We integrate sound over short spans, on the order of 5 to 10 milliseconds, for loudness and timbre judgments. That window smooths microfluctuations and sets a perceptual floor on time resolution. Chasing sub-microsecond numerical timing while ignoring room cues is like polishing a lens cap. Meanwhile, group delay from crossovers, misaligned drivers, or sloppy headphone phase swings can smear transients far more than any format delta. Phase-coherent speakers, time-aligned subs, and well-designed IEM crossovers buy real transient integrity. So where does Microdetail live? In the chain that keeps envelopes intact and noise low. Low distortion mics and preamps that capture, careful dynamics and saturation and mixing, solid reconstruction filters, quiet electronics, matched channels, and a room that doesn't throw early reflections at your face. The file's sample rate matters in production for headroom and filters. At playback, it's implementation and context. The myth isn't that timing and Microdetail don't matter. They do. The myth is assigning them to extra kilohertz instead of to the choices that actually shape time cues. When those choices are right, a dithered 16-bit 44.1 kilohertz file can deliver startling transients and a stable stage. When they're wrong, no Ultra HD badge will save the snap. And that sets up our next trap. When differences get small, belief gets loud. Expectation and suggestion can steer your ear toward phantom Microdetail or away from real ones. Let's talk about that. Expectation, suggestion, and placebo in audio. By now you've seen how tiny technical choices can move the needle. Here's the uncomfortable part. Belief can move it further. Expectation isn't a flaw in hearing, it's the engine. When you're told a new cable opens the soundstage, your brain makes a prediction, then hunts for evidence. Give it the slightest nudge, a half dB level mismatch, a subtle EQ difference, a brighter master, and it locks onto the story and won't let go. Sighted listening is fuel for that story. Seeing a glowing tube, a milled aluminum chassis, or a high-res badge primes you before the first note. Prices do too. The more a thing costs, the more your mind demands to hear value. In wine tests, fancy labels make the same bottle taste better. Audio is no different. Labels and rituals act like seasoning. You taste what you expect to taste. Here's a classic micro story. A friend group gathers to finally hear a $300 gold cable. The host swaps it in, faces light up, adjectives flow. Air, depth, separation. Then someone quietly swaps the expensive cable for the cheap original but keeps the gold cable sleeve in view. Reactions stay glowing. Only when they remove the sleeve and reveal the swap does the room get quiet. Nobody lied. Everyone listened sincerely. Their predictions shape their perceptions. Suggestion slips in other ways. If A and B aren't level matched within 1/10 of a dB, the louder one almost always wins, described as clearer or more detailed. A filter toggle labeled high RERS can sound nicer, even if it's just a slow roll-off curve. A different master can sneak into a comparison and carry the win for the format. Once a story forms, it's sticky. You'll reinterpret new notes to keep the story intact. This is why blind protocols matter. They don't kill the joy, they protect it. ABX takes eyesight and labels out of the loop, so you can find differences that survive without suggestion. If you pass, great, you found a real, repeatable improvement. If you fail, two good outcomes remain. Either the change is too small to matter in practice, or something else in your chain is masking it. Both save you time and money. The pushback is predictable. Blind tests are stressful. I hear worse under pressure. True, stress narrows focus, so make them friendly. Keep sessions short, take breaks, test at your normal listening level, use music you love and know intimately. Run a handful of trials, not 100. The goal isn't to win a lab contest, it's to avoid being steered by labels and pride. Another counter is trained ears can hear past tests. Training helps, but bias scales with experience too. Mastering engineers will tell you, they level match obsessively because even pros fall for louder is better. They'll also tell you that micro differences become obvious once the big stuff, room, speakers, masters, is handled. Blind checks keep you honest as your sensitivity grows. There's a deeper reason to care. Fairness to the music and the people who make it. If you attribute a better evening to a cable instead of the gentler master you bought, you're miscrediting craft as hardware. If you hear warmth in a vinyl pressing, check whether you're hearing the cut's dynamics, not the plastic. Being precise about causes lets you support the decisions that actually improve records. None of this means placebo is bad. Placebo is the brain using context to enhance experience. A beautiful object, a satisfying ritual, or a dedicated chair in a quiet corner can heighten your attention and deepen pleasure. If a well-made amp makes you want to sit and listen longer, that matters, even if a blind test can't prove its sonic edge. The trick is drawing a line between emotional value and acoustic value so you don't chase ghosts when you're after sound. Make a habit of gentle skepticism. Anytime you hear a change, ask, could level be different? Could EQ have shifted? Is the master the same? Am I sighted? Then, when it's practical, run a quick blind check. If the difference survives, you've earned your excitement. If it doesn't, you've saved your budget for upgrades that pass the lights off test. Here's a simple home protocol. Load 2 versions into a player that supports ABX. Normalize levels to within 0.1 dB. Pick a 30-second loop you know well, percussion with air, a vocal with sibilance, a sustained piano tail. Do 10 trials. If you score high, repeat tomorrow to confirm. If you hover around chance, accept it and move on. In the end, expectation and suggestion are part of music's magic. They can make an ordinary night feel special. Use them on purpose, through ritual and attention, not to justify costs or myths. When you separate belief from audibility, you don't become a cynic, you become a better listener. And that's the whole point of this trip. Practical listening playbook, upgrades that matter. Let's make this simple and unfairly effective. Start with the parts that move air, or seal your ear canal, if you use. Fix placement before buying anything. Form an equilateral triangle with your head, get tweeters at ear height, pull speakers 1 to 3 feet from the front wall, and toe them in until the center image snaps. Sit, listen, nudge, repeat. These inches are free upgrades. Tame the room necks. First reflection smear imaging. Catch them with thick curtains or panels beside and above your listening spot. A rug helps between you and the speakers. Bass booms and nulls, corner traps, or even stuffed bookcases make a bigger difference than any high-res badge. If you can swing it, add a subwoofer, not for more bass, but smoother bass. 2 subs placed thoughtfully beat one fancy unit. They fill nulls and even out the low end. Headphones? Choose tuning over hype. Find models with well-reviewed frequency response. Verify seal, especially with IEMs. Tip fit can swing the bass by 10 dB. If you want neutral, use gentle EQ to nudge, not carve. A small treble trim or a mid-bump can transform comfort and clarity. That single decision outperforms jumping from 16-bit to 24-bit on playback. Now the source chain. A competent DAC is quiet, linear, and boring. That's good. Pick reliability and needed features. An amp only matters when your headphones or speakers demand power. Check sensitivity and impedance. If clipping or noise isn't your issue, a pricier box won't fix the room. Cables should be sturdy, the right length, and appropriately thick for speakers. Balanced lines for long runs reduce hum. Beyond that, spend elsewhere. File formats come after masters. When you can, choose releases with dynamics intact. Look for notes like original mastering, dynamic version, or verified needle drops that mirror a gentler cut. If a high-res store offers a different master, that's the reason to buy, not the sample rate alone. For everyday listening, lossless is nice if bandwidth allows. Otherwise, a good AAC or AUG stream at reasonable bit rates is transparent in a commute. Save your perfectionism for the quiet room. Build 2 listening modes on purpose. Mode 1, casual. Streams, playlists, Bluetooth earbuds, noise around you. No guilt, music as a companion. Mode 2, dedicated. A chair, wired chain, level match tracks, and your favorite album start to finish. Dim distractions. If you only change this, your music will sound better without swapping a single component. Learn basic blind habits to protect your wallet. Level match within 0.5 dB before comparing anything. If you can, use an ABX tool to check whether a difference survives when you don't know which is which. Keep trials short, 10 attempts, and repeat on a different day. If the change vanishes, move your budget to the room, transducers, or masters. If it holds, enjoy the upgrade with real confidence. Use training tracks that expose weak links. For transient honesty, pick brush snare, claves, or hand percussion. For sibilance and harshness, use a close-mic'd female vocal. For bass control, try an upright bass walking line or kick with quick doubles. For decay and low-level detail, a solo piano tail and a reverberant classical hall cue. Build a playlist of 5 such cuts. They'll tell you more in 5 minutes than a day of random shuffling. Small, cheap tweaks add up. Mark your volume at a consistent reference level. so loudness biases stop fooling you. Calibrate left and right balance so the image centers without leaning. Label input trims so you don't unknowingly overdrive a stage. Tidy cable runs to reduce hum. Dust your stylus and clean your records if you spin vinyl. Contact noise can masquerade as digital glare in comparisons. Streaming settings matter. In app preferences, force the highest available quality on Wi-Fi. Disable loudness normalize. If you're evaluating dynamics, then re-enable it for everyday use to keep volume steady between tracks. If a service offers multiple masters, audition them level matched. Keep notes. You'll start to see patterns in what you prefer, often a little more crest factor, a hair less 3 kHz bite, and no hard clipping. A quick upgrade ladder in order: fix seat and speaker placement, treat first reflections, ensure headphone seal, choose a well-tuned headphone or speaker, add a sub and integrate it, verify clean power for your load, pick better masters, set lossless when it's free, only then fuss with DAC filters or boutique accessories. Each rung you climb makes the next one more audible. Skip steps and you'll chase ghosts. Finally, schedule listening. Once a week, give an album your full attention. No phone, no screens, keep a pen handy. Jot 1 note per track, something about arrangement, space, or emotion. This costs nothing and trains your ear faster than any spec sheet. You'll hear engineers' decisions, not just formats. And once you hear decisions, you'll know exactly what to upgrade next. The beautiful compromise, engineering for human ears. To understand why digital audio works as well as it does, we need to go back to the original aim. Not mathematical perfection, but perceptual truth. The CD standard, 44.1 kHz, 16-bit, wasn't picked at random. It was engineered around human hearing. Bandwidth beyond our audible top and dynamic range that comfortably covers music in real rooms. From day one, Psychoacoustics sat in the blueprint. We don't hear all frequencies equally. Loud sounds mask soft neighbors. Our time resolution lives in envelopes and phase relationships, not in infinite band impulses. Engineers leaned on these truths and built a system that fits our ears instead of fighting the limits of physics. Dither, filtering, masking. These aren't hacks. They're design trade-offs. Quantization creates distortion. Dither turns that into neutral noise. Anti-alias filters protect the audible band and keep outliers from folding back. Perceptual encoders take the masking we know and use it ruthlessly to shrink files without shrinking the experience. Each move admits the system's limits and then hides the bill where we're least likely to notice. The result isn't a perfect copy of the air in the room. It's a convincing version of the music in your head. This shaped more than playback. It steered how music gets made. Producers learned to work inside these guardrails. They track hot enough to beat room noise, but low enough to keep headroom. They mix with dynamics that survive normalization and phones. Mastering engineers choose filters and noise shaping curves that flatter material without drawing attention to themselves. The ecosystem evolved around the listener, not the oscilloscope. When you feel a record sit right at normal volume, that's the system landing where your hearing is most sensitive. The beautiful compromise also changed what we buy and how we value it. Lossless streaming and high-rage storefronts are less about ultrasonic treasure hunts and more about signaling care. When a platform commits to clean pipelines or a label issues a gentle master in a larger container, the benefit you hear comes from decisions, not digits alone. Meanwhile, the CD sweet spot is still real. For most listening, living rooms, headphones, normal levels, a well-made 16.44.1 file is transparent. That's not settling. It's matching the chain to perception. Preferences persist because music isn't only sensation, it's story. Vinyl's ritual, tape's glue, tube gears glow. These add emotional context that shapes what you notice and how long you stick around. Analog warmth is a curated set of euphonic errors, and digital clarity is a curated absence of chaos. Both are human aligned. One flatters with tone and texture, the other with reach and repeatability. We choose between them the way we choose lenses for a photograph. Mood, subject, and intent lead. Spec sheets follow. Looking forward, the compromise gets finer rather than louder. Lossless streaming will dominate pipelines. Better masters, optimized for dynamics and platform targets, will matter more than logo badges. Spatial audio can work when it respects psychoacoustics. Stable localization, sensible room cues, no gimmick panning that fights head-related transfer functions. Headphone tech will keep closing the gap to rooms with improved tunings and personalized EQ. None of that requires chasing numbers past the point where hearing stops caring. It requires engineering around how hearing actually works. So where does that leave the promise we open with? You've never actually heard music? Right here. Everything you love about a record is a reconstruction. Your ears collect pressure wiggles, your brain builds voices in space. Digital audio leans into that, discards what you won't miss, and protects what you will. The trick isn't that the system lies. It tells a selective truth aimed straight at human perception. That's why ABX tests so often come up empty on high-RARS claims, while great masters flatten arguments. The meaning lives in decisions, not margins. This isn't an argument against ambition. It's a call to aim it where it pays off. In studios, 24-bit depth, prudent sample rates, careful nonlinear processing. In playback, rooms, speakers, headphones, placement, and masters. In platforms, honest pipelines, and metadata that tells you what version you're hearing. In listeners, rituals that make attention easy. The more we align the chain with how we hear, the more the lie feels like the best kind of truth, one that delivers emotion reliably on demand. And that's the quiet genius of digital audio. It doesn't chase an unreachable ideal. It builds an experience that survives cars, kitchens, commutes, and quiet nights alike. It gives artists predictable canvases and gives you predictable joy. The beautiful compromise isn't settling. It's designed for human beings. Your favorite songs are convincing fakes. Crafted approximations aimed at your ears and brain, not test gear. If you want more of the truth that matters, subscribe for the next deep dive on hearing illusions and watch the follow-up linked here, then run. One experiment this week. Level match two masters you love and listen in a quiet room. The moment you hear the difference, the myths go quiet and the music gets louder.